they could come to statements which agree with statements that arise from empirical evidence and rational thought, but monkeys on a typewriter over 1 million years would do the same thing.
Okay, Lawrence, one of the standing rules within the history of philosophy, especially over the last 300 years, has been that an is does not necessitate an ought.
Women are not inferior and gays are not bad. That moral improvement has occurred because of an empirical evidence. What do you mean by intrinsic worth?
No, most scientists don't read philosophy.
It's an empirical fact, and I like empirical facts. In fact, they're the only kind of facts. It's redundant.
Two pretty contentious philosophical moral positions about ethical decision-making. One is called consequentialism, and the other is called utilitarianism.
Yeah, I've heard those labels. Yeah.
Oh.
We had a meeting at my institute on science and morality, and so I got to learn about those labels. It's a process of thinking about how the world works.
Empirical evidence.
Empirical evidence. Let me finish.
If you talk about what knowing is, other ways of knowing are an illusion. It ultimately comes from some empirical basis. Or I don't think there are other ways of knowing.
Right. Professor Dennett, is it right that every knowledge is derived from empirical evidence?
I would say no. But other sorts of geometry.
But don't you think a proof is an empirical piece of work? I mean, it's
No.
I'm going to follow up on Dan's comment on mathematics, which is one example. Logic, of course, is another one. They're closely related for obvious reasons. But I think we need to be careful about how we use the words like science or empirical evidence.
Empirical evidence. Empirical evidence.
Because, yes, if you expand empirical evidence to, say, including the cross-checking of proofs, then pretty much everything that deals with language becomes empirical.
Yeah, even theology would become empirical.
But yeah, exactly. But I think that is, in some sense, cheating, because when people think of science, and even when most scientists think of science, that's not what they're thinking about.
I think that your definition as empiricism.
Empirical evidence. Rational argument.
I'm wondering if you're not trading a little bit on the philosophical and moral ignorance of your usual audiences by throwing out things like that as if they are non-contentious, simply rational given topics.
Well, look, the point is, I think you're well aware of my opinion about the utility of philosophy, and let's not get there.
Withering contempt for philosophy.
We have several examples of entire disciplines, including science itself, of course, originating from philosophy. Yeah. Now, what happens at that point? It's interesting. So we can mention several cases, so broad cases, like science itself came out of, what used to be natural philosophy. People like Descartes and even Newton actually thought themselves as philosophers.
But for example, holding to an Aristotelian notion and requiring, and not also. I'm not
Nobody holds Aristotelian notions
anymore.
anymore.
If you did.
But I do get nervous when I hear scientists, and some scientists, because I don't want to make the generalization too much, too broad. But when I hear sometimes, well, most of philosophy does X or Z or Y. I bet that most of those scientists have never actually read a technical paper in philosophy. So that's an empirical question. How can you make a generalization about what most philosophy does?
Actually, you hit the key point I was going to get to, which may sound judgmental, but it's not.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
And that is, and it then is a simple empirical fact, but it is a fact that the reason most scientists don't read philosophy is it doesn't have any impact on what they do.
You can't do science without doing philosophy.
You can't do science without doing philosophy.
You can do it seat of the pants. Some people are either brilliant or lucky, and they never consult any philosophers, and they don't make any howlers philosophically. And so they're in pretty good shape. And anybody like that, I think, is, in a certain sense, entitled to say, I'm just going to ignore philosophy. I don't seem to need it. But the fact is that in the areas which are particularly controversial, everything to do with the mind, all of neuroscience, the scientists really smart people and they know their fields. And very often they're asking questions that are just preposterous.
I don't know what philosophers are asking.
You say that you derive some sort of guilty pleasure from watching eminent scientists who have expressed what you call withering contempt for philosophy, and to watch those scientists stumble embarrassingly in their own philosophical efforts.
I got to learn about those labels.
Can you give us any names, Professor Dennett? Who are these scientists?
Oh, sure.
Humiliating us. Off the record, like.
I want to go back to what Lawrence said about philosophy of science and the role between philosophy of science and the relationship between philosophy of science and science, because I am, as I said, both a scientist and a philosopher of science. And I'm going to put forth, and this is the presumptuous part, that what you said a few minutes ago, was both conceptually incorrect and empirically wrong.
Empirical.
You, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, others have been criticized not just by religious folk, but also by philosophers.
I've heard those labels.
You're absolutely right. I don't think the best way to lead to enlightenment is to tell people they're stupid. That's probably true.
Tell your friends Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins.
People who are interested in art and aesthetics, that science has tried to fill too much of the field and tried to explain a little bit too much. I understand that you disdain that, but I'm just wondering if you could sort of explain maybe a bit why.
Well, that's an ignorant statement.
No, I mean, I'm often stereotyped as, but...
You can't do science without doing philosophy.
I agree. I think you're not answering the question that philosophers
No, we don't agree. If I'm not asking a question that's vague and ill-defined, you're right. I'm sorry.
Clearly, you can come up with an expansive enough definition of science. If you say, science has to do with anything that has even remotely input from the empirical world. And I define input from the empirical world, even the kinds of things we were talking about earlier in terms of mathematics and logic. Then, of course, everything is science. You sort of win by definition. But the problem is with that sort of expansive,
vague and ill-defined
definition is the two can play that game, right? I mean, I can say, well, philosophy is about thinking, and since everything we do implies thinking, that we're always philosophizing.
Spiritual belief is just clearly wrong.
That's not the
Atheists
claim.
are moral
That's
people.
not the claim.
No, but
Nobody
the
has
point
claimed that
the point
belief is necessary for morality.
What's that?
It's been apparent to me for some time that philosophy and science might have actually lost touch with the ability in some ways of speaking to one another.
People are conscious beings. They experience pain and suffering. And from having experienced those things, it's unpleasant.
Yeah.
And in fact, by trying to minimize that, we make it more pleasant.
Pleasure.
That's a very different ethic, Dr. Krauss. There's
No,
a
that's
self-interest
what I mean by
ethic.
intrinsic worth.
That's totally different than the consequentialism and utilitarianism.
So I got to learn about those labels. Who has the right to determine whether someone should live or die? You'd say it's God. You'd say God said the Canaanites should die. I mean, I'm going back to it because I find what you said so morally reprehensible that it sickens me. Osama bin Laden would say the United States and Australia are morally reprehensible and we have to destroy them. What's wrong with him saying that? Well, just like, I'm sorry. I mean, one last thing. Just like the people in the World Trade Center, Osama bin Laden.